This is a paper I'm working on with my colleague Sujit Sur, who recently moved to Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. He was previously at Dalhousie University in Halifax. And I want to thank you for the privilege of being the last presenter of the conference. Hopefully there will be some questions here that will launch us towards our next meeting in about a year. This paper was inspired by some research I did a few years ago in the public transportation industry. And the focus there was looking at some of the more innovative practices that were done relative to sustainability initiatives in public transit. So in that research we looked at the public transit of Montreal, the public transit of San Francisco and Portland in the US. And due to limited funds, we did not go to a lot of other places where we could have seen public transit initiatives that were quite pioneering. But we felt there was a lot that we could learn from these sites. So this paper is inspired by something we found that was not anticipated in that work. That work was geared towards understanding what capabilities do firms develop and how do they do it. And what we found that was unanticipated was the network of collaborations that are needed to implement some of these initiatives. And so the paper that I'm presenting today is focused on those kinds of cooperative arrangements. And we call the paper Cooperative Capacity and Sustainable Transportation, with a focus on capacity because we felt, as we're going through the data, there's more than a cooperative agreement. There's some capacity that companies and organizations develop as they're going through initiatives and going through implementing these initiatives and learning how to cooperate among each other is a capacity that's quite unique. So some of the background of this research is competition is intrinsic to business strategy, and we're grounding a lot of this work in business strategy. And business strategy is all about competition. At the same time, there is a lot more research coming out looking at sustainability initiatives being based on collaborative arrangements. There have been quite a few papers written just in the last 10 years, a couple of hundred papers, on how collaborative agreements, strategic alliances have played an important part in implementing sustainability. So it is a very complex web that's being woven among organizations. And so what we're looking at is strategy for sustainability an issue of competition, or is it an issue of collaboration, or is it something in between? And when we're looking specifically at the context of public transit, is it a competitive scenario or is it a collaborative scenario? So is it a lonely road to get you somewhere, or are there multiple roads that get you there? The question that we're most interested in asking in this particular work is, how do concepts of cooperation and sustainability offer the paradigmatic context that enlarge decisional capacity of organizations to a resource abundance logic from the more traditional resource scarcity logic, which we're used to. So the model that we're drawing from here is a model developed in the mid-1990s by Chen and colleagues, looking at how to identify competitors. And so they're saying, depending on how many markets you have in common with other organizations, and depending on how many resources you're drawing from, if you're drawing from a lot of the same resources and you're competing in a lot of the same markets, then you're here. And that's how you identify your direct competitors. If you're using different resources, so you're low on resource similarity, for example, one company might be using a lot of talented people, another company might be relying on raw materials that are unique, right? So that would be low resource similarity, but you're still competing in the same markets. That would be an indirect competition. Similarly, if you're using a lot of the same resources, but you're not competing in a lot of the same markets, there is, again, indirect competition because you're going to be competing for your resources. An example here would be some companies are making smartphones, other companies are making LCD TVs. They might not both be making both of these products, but they're using a lot of the same raw materials, and some of them are rare and highly regulated. What we know very little about is this quadrant here, which most strategy work waves off saying there's really no real competition going on here. You don't need to worry about these people. So this is a quadrant that when we teach strategy we often leave off, or we leave blank, we don't talk about it, because you don't need to worry about these people. If you're in a competitive mindset and paradigm, this is what you need to worry about. This is what induces fear in the boardroom. That's your work right there. So in this particular paper, we're twisting this around and we're saying maybe in some context this doesn't need to be the case. Maybe these arrows have to be placed differently. You don't need to worry so much about indirect competitors becoming direct competitors. Maybe you need to worry about how do you work with your indirect competitors in some kind of a collaborative setting. So the research context for us is public transit. And this research context might be expanded to other places as well, but we focused on transportation because that's where we had the data, and that's where we started seeing these patterns emerging. Now, what is public transportation? Have any of you, in your short stay here in Montreal, used public transportation at all? Yeah. Some of you have? Yeah, cool. In Montreal, public transportation is a very diverse system. You have everything from taxis, which some of you might have used from the airport, to a complex bus system, which is connected to a metro system. Then you also have this bicycle share program along with a car share program or two. Okay? So you have all of these different choices as a consumer of public transit, and while you may prefer one versus the other, you do have the other choices available to you. So in public transit, you do have issues of private versus public. Some transit agencies are all public, some transit agencies are partly private shareholder owned, and this guides some of their decision making. There are also different means of transit and different legitimacies. Maybe a metro system, because it's been around for a long time, is more legitimate than a bicycle sharing scheme. There are also cultural aspects. In some countries, public transit is not seen very well or is not seen as very effective. And I think in California we've had a long struggle of legitimizing public transit, and we're still working on that. And then also, public transit depends from one place to another depending on the needs of the population. Some people want convenience. Everybody wants some sort of convenience. Other people want reliability. And some people are concerned about sustainability. And that's something that comes out of your presentation. A lot of people are concerned about how hotels and sometimes public transit, are they running their operations in a green way? But public transit essentially is supposed to be a solution to a lot of our environmental issues. For instance, if you have a car but choose to use public transit, you are diminishing your environmental impact in most situations. Then there's also the issue of competition, which we explored, and in interview work, we asked our respondents that work for public transportation agencies, do you see yourself as competing on the market with, and with whom? And in most cases they stated that they do see themselves as competing most generally with other transportation forms like cars. So they would say this in the form of, the more cars we get off the road, the more successful we are. So they do feel like they're working in a competitive environment. So on the demand side, now recall the 2x2 I showed you before. On one hand you had resource similarity, on the other hand you had market commonality. So on market commonality, public transit does see themselves as competing with other means of transportation. Now, not all means of transportations are feasible comparisons. For instance, you can't really compare a plane with a bus system in a city, right? You can compare the bus system with a car system, or a bus system with a bicycle that individuals own. Here also they say sometimes public transit can be supported by policy. In other words, they can make driving a lot less interesting by having policies such as high parking fees. And if you've had to park your car in Montreal, you'll know how much that burns at $6 an hour. In California, parking fees are much lower. Sometimes you go as much as $1 an hour. So the policy difference there is quite different. On the supply side, you also have some form of competition that we may not always think about. For example, funding. Public transit agencies are funded through either sales taxes in some instances, or simply government grants, or other forms of funding, mostly coming from the government. In some instances, they also come from some form of shareholders. Also, energy is a resource that's used in public transit, and it has quite a big impact on energy use. One area that in San Francisco we were told that there's quite a bit of competition for public transit that wants to go green is clean energy. Apparently there's not as much clean energy available as many people would like to have. So for those that want to use conventional energy, they still have access to that market. If you're a large consumer of energy and want clean energy, you're going to be competing for it. So what the public transit in San Francisco has done, they've invested themselves in large solar farms to gain some access and leverage some of their potential there. And here's a quote from one executive in public transit. He said, "There's big competition for any alternative power source right now. There's so many public agencies that want to get a green source of power that there's a big competition for it. Even if you want to be green, not every agency will have power from wind or other renewable sources. Supplies for renewable energy are increasing, but are still not a big percentage of overall energy production." And that is still a reality in many urban areas in North America today. The model we're proposing, and this is based on Chen's model from the mid-90s, is how do we move public transit to think more in terms of the broader picture than in terms of who are they competing with. And the model is quite different in terms of, if you're thinking of yourself as competing with other forms of transportation, then the best choice you have, or the best mode of operation, is to lobby for policy to get those other forms of transportation out of the road. If you're thinking collaboratively, then you're thinking of your indirect competitors as potential collaborators rather than as potential direct competitors. So in public transit, you have, on market commonality, you're competing with automobile and other means of transportations. In terms of resources, you're competing with other agencies that seek public funding or access to clean energy. If you can find common ground between these different agencies and actors, then you can get to something that we call total transit cooperation. In other words, finding ways to work with everyone, or at least some of the interested actors that you have shared values with, to increase the pool of options for transit users, and in the end really get more people out of their cars. Now, this is not a simple problem. This is the example of the subway map for Montreal. And while they really tried to cover all of the areas and is one of the most effective subways in North America, there's a lot of white spaces. And some of those white spaces are covered by buses. What the Montreal Metro thought, why don't we try to partner up with some other forms of transportation and cover more of the white spaces? So they've partnered with the car sharing scheme here, and they've partnered with the Bixi, the bicycle sharing scheme, in an effort to reduce costs on the consumer side, but also get more consumers to also use their monthly passes. So if you buy a monthly pass with the subway system, you're getting a reduced rate for the car share as well as the bicycle share program. And this is increasing, it's increasing awareness for consumers that they have these options. So I'll give you an example of a commute that you might do. You come out of your apartment, which is maybe 5 blocks away from a subway station, and it's not winter. Okay, this scenario does not work very well in winter. You walk out of your apartment. You take a bicycle from the bicycle share station from your home to a subway stop, and then you take your subway to work. So this is how consumers have more options, and they can shorten the amount of time they spend on their commute. So you have partnerships with local bicycles and car sharing schemes. You have partnerships with municipality parking services to offer advantageous commuting options for individuals that are willing to park outside of the downtown core, that way reducing the traffic within the downtown. Also, you have partnerships between developers of green technology that became co-applicants for government grants to develop and implement a new green technology that's being used in public transit. So really what we're proposing is that total transit cooperation would bring together multiple entities around some shared values. And these shared values could be around sustainability values. And the development that is being done in some cities like Portland is a transit-oriented development, which is meant to reduce traffic in downtown areas and also reduce the time people spend commuting from place to place. So some areas of discussion as I'm drawing towards the end here. We are contrasting competitive strategic models to offer something that's new, the idea of cooperation in a total transit model here. Cooperative capacity, we propose, has the potential to enhance performance outcomes for multiple players rather than just for one player that may otherwise find themselves in positions of indirect competition. The condition here is to expand the scope of substitution and accept non-traditional alliance frameworks. So here, if we're thinking about resource similarity, if you're thinking you're competing for the same resources, then you're going to be in a competitive situation. If you're thinking in terms of substitution and what do we both want, then you might find some new ways of doing this. In conclusion, the ability to identify potential shared values in a competitive environment, we think, is a valuable cooperative, or can lead to a valuable cooperative capacity. It also potentially can lead to competitive advantages against direct competition. And overall, organizations can improve their own performance and contribute significantly to solving societal and environmental problems. And in this context, we're offering the example of public transportation. Thank you very much.